Welcome to Lab Life with the Air Force Research Laboratory.
Hi, I'm Michelle.
And I'm Kenneth. Hello, folks. Today we are joined by Dr. Alex Alaniz to discuss the buzz around Chat GPT, a chatbot of his own that emulates famed physicist Albert Einstein, and his take on artificial intelligence in wargaming.
In 3, 2, 1.
Dr. Alaniz, welcome to the podcast.
Morning.
Yeah, we're so excited to have you here today. You're the principal investigator for Weapon Engagement Optimizer, which, I mean, literally the acronym is Whopper. So it's a big deal. And we're going to talk about your work at the Air Force Research Laboratory, but we're even more hyped to have you here because there's this thing in the news that's taking over the news, Chat GPT, and we hear that you can explain that to us. So what can you tell us about Chat GPT and the technology behind it?
Chat GPT is a culmination of a lot of work in various kinds of machine learning, reinforcement learning. Essentially, it's a technology that has read the entire internet and built statistical models for natural language. Some of the ChatGPT 2 had 1.75 billion parameters after reading the internet. The ChatGPT 3 was at 300 billion parameters, and it builds statistical models, and it allows you to do very clever things like, say, create me a 10-page PowerPoint on climate change from the point of view of a Latin American country or an island country, and it will do that. Someone in a restaurant said, write me a script in the style of Scorsese for a movie with its plot, and it will do that. And so it's uncanny, and it gives you the idea that maybe we've captured a little bit of humanity within the machine. However, let me caveat that, and there is a GitHub location dedicated to ChatGPT to show its limitations. And I saw a YouTube this weekend of a teacher, I believe, and she was saying how you can use it and how you can write essays and study people, historical people. And it's quite scary because she was saying you create it as a reference dictionary or reference encyclopedia rather. And when you start looking at its limitations, it will give you the correct answers roughly 80% of the time. I created a different chatbot avatar for Albert Einstein, and I loaded it with all sorts of stuff. And when I compared it to ChatGPT, I asked a specific question. If you're well read up on Einstein, one of his closest friends during the early part of his life was Paul Ehrenfest, one of the great physicists, who didn't think he was one of the great physicists, and he's kind of depressive. And he had two sons, and one of them had Down syndrome. And it's a historical fact that Paul Ehrenfest murdered his son with Down syndrome, turned the gun on himself, and killed himself. And when I asked ChatGPT to assume the persona of Einstein, you go, ask Einstein, how were you impacted by Paul Ehrenfest's murder-suicide of his son and himself? And it came back and said, what are you talking about? Paul Ehrenfest was a great dad. And, he never murdered his sons, and it goes on like that. And I asked also complicated questions, say, on Einstein and his first wife and his second wife. And, whereas ChatGPT would come back and say, they had a complicated relationship with the first wife, and it would actually miss lots of historical facts that with a quick Google, the first thing that would come up was a New York Times article, saying there were letters between first wife, complaining about first wife to second wife, and ChatGPT saying no such thing. So it's scary in the sense that if you don't do independent research, you're going to be sold a lot of untruth by ChatGPT. I mean, maybe 20% of the time, but that's not good.
And that's something we've heard, at least looking in the news, is that a lot of it is used as a reference document or a tool. It's a way to guide, like I've heard folks talking about using it for the medical fields, for editors and papers, saying like this is a rubric, but you have to massage it after the fact. It's not end all be all. With that said, since you're working this personally, we're really going to break into this more later in the podcast. But I really want to ask this now, at least, to kind of plant that seed. How are people building that trust then? Is there a way they're pointing at different databases to better read and be more accurate? Or is that 80% margin where it's kind of stuck at?
Well, the claims are from ChatGPT, the company, is that by letting it out to to us, the public, that the more we use it, more it will correct itself. But it's preponderance of data. I mean, if you're off on, say, medical, and we use WebMD, right? If there's not that much data as there would be on popular stuff, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be that risk that there's not enough data for it to give proper advice.
I'd like to tie back to something you introduced, the thought of you have an Einstein Chat Bot. What is that?
Einstein Chat Bot is a data structure and methods that are quite simple, actually, but they took about 2.5 years to put together. And let me back that up with the inspiration for Einstein Chat Bot. I spent my entire life looking at how everything's related to everything and hierarchically connected from particles all the way to stock markets to the Big Bang. I've always been fascinated by how do we learn? How do we organize our thoughts? How are we so efficient in handling so much information? And the clue I got was about several years ago when I was thinking about Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf. And so therefore her connection to the world was tactile. And she said that her connection to the world began with Braille when her teacher put her hand in a stream of water and then her other hand on these dots, Braille, and Helen made these connections. Oh, this symbol and this tactile sensation are an equivalence. And so I put together a thought experiment where I imagined a gigantic, tall, empty warehouse full of, for simplicity, full of whiteboards on the first floor, second floor. It's open space. And so the first thing you do is you have water connected to Braille, and then water connected to, say, household items like cup and glass and sink and shower, and then maybe a whiteboard. And so within that whiteboard, you would have connections of these concepts that are somewhat independent but somewhat related, and then maybe a whiteboard nearby on bodies of water, rivers and oceans, and then maybe activities on a different whiteboard, boating and vacationing and cruising and hurricanes. And I can imagine a police detective movie where the detective is tying strings between the whiteboards, and there's probabilistic links, right, as the detective is trying to solve the mystery. So what I did is I followed that paradigm, and I spent 2.5 years roughly creating 101 chatbots, each one an expert at one slice of Einstein's life. His thoughts on atom bombs, his thoughts on the future of humanity, his thoughts on relativity, on the future of physics, on just 101, all the way down to his favorite foods and whether he liked cats or dogs, his personal life. And what took time was that each one of the chatbots, each one of those whiteboards in Helen Keller's warehouse, for me to connect historically accurate the different sentences, and then between the different whiteboards to connect. Well, if you asked Einstein, my chatbot, well, what did you do to relax? It may land on, well, I would play Mozart, or it may land on, I would go sailing, or in some order that way. And it's probabilistic so that people are using the chatbot. They're not getting the very mechanical, repetitive thing. They're actually experiencing the shadow of what history left behind, who Albert Einstein was. And so it's 101 chatbots with a master chatbot that decides where to go and start replying to the user. So it has a topological structure, the diagrams on the whiteboard and the strings between whiteboards. And I think that's how we humans are structured, and that's a missing element in today's quest for general artificial intelligence.
Well, first, I love the visual you built beforehand, saying kind of like being like a Dick Tracy, if you will, hitting the ground and doing this kind of investigative work. And that's a really important question we wanted to ask you. You just hit it in the head, or at least opened that door. Your Einstein chatbot, you said, is another bridge step to making something sound more human, not just robotic and spitting out a response. And you're saying that the idea behind that is this connective tissue you're building feels more naturalistic. It has a variation of responses like we would have. Is that kind of that element, or what are you doing to make this feel more human?
It's exactly the text files that feed the 101 chatbots are exactly that analogy of the Helen Keller warehouse. So each whiteboard would be a text file, and then the strings between whiteboards would be the probabilistic connections. Mm-hmm. I'm actually working with a fellow who's pretty good at Chat GPT, and the idea would be to overlay Einstein atop this Chat GPT technology, and therefore take it to the next level of general artificial intelligence. So we'll see what he does, and that's why I'm interested in doing this podcast. Is it's time to layer in what we're missing to make Chat GPT the next level of an AI, and I'm hoping this gets the word out there and helps spread it out there.
Just from a human element, I have to ask, why Einstein? Is it because you're a physicist?
Yes, but I mean, I began studying him when I was probably 12, 13 age, roughly. And so it was natural because I've had the most exposure to him. It wasn't necessarily him. As other physicists go, I'm very interested in Lisa Meitner. She was the lady who figured out you can make atom bombs and did not get the Nobel Prize. She, in my opinion, and in history's opinion, robbed. So There's just so much more literature. There's all the scientific papers, all the PhDs who've analyzed him scientifically, and then there's the more personal biography. So there's just a lot of data on him. So it's easier.
Oh, that makes sense to have the reliable data set as you build these connections and in a whiteboard analogy that you gave. I'm curious now, do I have to use the Einstein Chat Bot to find out what Einstein's favorite food was, or do you recall?
I think he said spaghetti.
Wow.
It's elegant. It's simple. And well, a part of this too that I'm racking my brain with is, so when you mentioned gathering a lot of this data for it with the chatbots you built, how much of this was based on books you read versus things online? Was there a blend, or was this all pointed online from resources you found?
Clearly, the things dealing with history, with the 1910s, 20s, 40s, all the way to the 50s, that with his professional life and his science and his interaction with post-World War II with political leaders, that's all very well documented in book. Finding the stuff on pets and stuff was a heavy internet search.
I'm sure. Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure there's
and then you have to verify it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like you said, sometimes you got to check, like, hey, was he a cat person or a dog person? I mean, your chatbot would know now, but you have to understand, you got to double check it. So
a little more cat. I mean, sorry, a little more dog. Not. But he had a problem with cats.
Trust me, I mean, I've grown up with both. I love I have my own dog. If I wasn't allergic, I'd also love cats. So I get if he's got a similar caveat. But I'm curious too. Like, so Michelle had a good point asking about the food. Is there any like interesting fun facts about like Einstein you found out through this journey? Something that 13-year-old you would have been like, that is so cool.
No, the 13-year-old was very interested in general relativity. He just his network of friends and what he did to stay connected to the world. He was very connected to Hollywood. So there you go, something interesting.
That's really cool. So as in like he was just a fan of his works, or did they exchange?
Yeah, they were close friends, and they met a lot and interacted a lot.
See, something. This is why the chatbot's important to talk to and the person behind it. You learn stuff like this.
So I find that I printed out the chatbot, which is about 150 pages of text, so that I can play with my own chatbot because there's so much to it.
I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, speaking of that many pages, that's a lot of work. What were some of the difficulties in making this software?
Making the software was trivial. I found a teaching chatbot out there with the Children's Glossary for Astronomy in Python. I studied the algorithms. I saw the libraries it was calling in Natural Language Toolkit, NLTK, and I just taught myself Python and NLTK tools, and then I just started modifying, creating 101 versions of it, and then tying them together. So the hard work was the tying them together historically.
And ultimately, what do you hope that the Einstein chatbot does, or is the foundation for?
I hope it's an eye-opener for the people who are doing statistical methods. Chat GPT is uncanny when there's a lot of data, and it makes the right connection statistically. To get to, in my opinion, our artificial general intelligence, you will need to take the methods and data structure I created and overlay them. And I thought it was going to be very challenging, but when I presented this to a fellow in machine learning who's good on Chat GPT, he said, "Oh no, we've got tools." So as we speak, he's working on this, and we'll see what he produces. He thinks it's going to be a natural blending of the structure to Chat GPT, and then Chat GPT won't make mistakes, at least regarding Einstein. Chat GPT is uncanny, it's language model. And mine's a little mechanical because it's text that I created. And so, eventually you will repeat if you interact with it enough. And Chat GPT is just amazing. It's language.
And that's one of the things I think that makes it so simple and so great is you doing this first foundational groundwork will help inspire others to hopefully join in and do the same, or pull in people doing similar work.
And so the applications are, imagination wants to wander around. I think you can make digital companionship seems to be a big thing, especially with the Facebook Meta, or make copies of yourself, leave copies of yourself behind. Or people, historians, and someone saying, you could maybe interact with historical people and ask what if questions. And now, if you're going to ask what if questions to people who have passed on in history, well, then you're going to have to add your best guess as to, and I did that for Einstein. And, hey, Einstein, did you ever think you were going to do gravitational wave astronomy? Because I don't think he would have thought it's possible. But I went ahead and created a fictional future Einstein as if he was cognizant of current technology and science.
And I think being a fan of sci-fi, what you built here is a framework for a lot of what Star Trek has in the holodeck. The idea of having this predictive idea and this personage that can really answer questions and interact with you. I mean, it's a base model that builds, but it sparks my mind to think of that, of how I could sit in a room and just talk to Einstein.
And the wargaming community also has expressed interest in it, and naturally, because they want to see how people might act or imitate a commander or imitate someone in that role.
And that's a perfect question too, because that's one of the big things we want to see is how this could tie into AFRL or even the Air Force's mission. It sounds like that's the case. Like they could be this commander, or at least you said either historic or present. Like, could you kind of dive into that a bit?
So professionally, I mean, my branch here at AFRL, we do wargaming modeling, simulation analysis, and we've created the Whoppers we started off with. That put my foot in the door to much larger projects with the Department of Defense. They have a joint all-domain command and control program. The Air Force's answer to that is the Advanced Battle Management System. And it's about how do we leverage traditional machine learning and artificial intelligence at all levels, whether it's inside maybe some autonomous vehicle making decisions, or whether we're wargaming at a tactical level or strategic level. I think this is all nascent, so that makes it exciting as well. So there's a large interest within DoD and Air Force, obviously, to pursue these kinds of thoughts.
Well, to step back a minute, maybe for some of our listeners that might not have such a military background, what is wargaming?
That's a great question. I don't know if people might be familiar with the old game of Risk, but it's essentially a competition between two sides, and one of them is trying to win, and hopefully the other one doesn't win. Wargaming goes back to its mathematical inception, goes back to World War II with the famous mathematician von Neumann, who created game theory. I mean, you can think of it as playing Monopoly, and you can think of that as a very simple form of wargaming, where you're trying to take the domination of the board. Or you can think of it as wargaming in terms of my teenage boy who gets on the internet and puts on virtual reality goggles, and they're playing virtual wargaming with aircraft and tanks and taking, objectives on land, etc. It's a broad field. It also extends to the Ivy League towers, where people just discuss things and write essays. It can be boring like that as well.
I mean, hey, I think it's exciting. And as a student of history myself, I remember hearing about some of the proto work in the First World War, where they would assign health, if you will, or at least points to different models and aircraft to help simulate some work on the ground as well. Like it's grown in an incredible way over the past century.
And I think it goes back to something Eisenhower said, that all plans are worthless, but planning is the most important thing. That exercising this, right? Planning. Whereas all plans individually are probably worthless. Gaming probably plays into helping you plan for contingencies.
Absolutely. And I know we got kind of a snapshot of what you do day to day, or at least kind of your role in the actual wargaming modeling and simulation analysis branch here. But what kind of work goes into actually gathering this information and programming the situation?
So at the Directed Energy Directorate, the wargaming we do is at the tactical to more campaign level stuff. And so we gather a lot of real world information on what we may be facing with as threats, and we look at what we have as assets. And so we do a lot of work to prepare a realistic thing. We ask the war fighters who actually do these missions and how they would plan out. And then we layer in the technology that we're developing here at AFRL-RD, Directed Energy, the high-powered microwave, the electromagnetic effectors. And then we create about a week's worth of exercises where we bring warfighters in. They'll sit in simulation chairs. They'll have the Whoppers helping them either as air battle managers or as fighter pilots or on the ground, defending assets. And so right now we've been concentrating on defense of assets on the ground. And so that's what we're doing.
Okay, fascinating. That's a really cool breakdown of how the data you collect and how you put it all together. That's a lot of moving pieces. And I know you mentioned at the top, and I want to connect back to that, you said the magic word Whopper again. Can you kind of dive into exactly what that is and how your role ties into it?
So the current versions of Whopper, and as it has taken a while to mature them, we have an air battle manager that, imagine sitting somewhere in an aircraft such as AWACS, but it's not necessarily associated with AWACS.
Okay.
And suggesting to the air battle managers, if you have these air assets airborne with these effectors on them, weapons on them, how to best allocate them to the threats that are inbound and around the airspace. We're working with human machine teaming folks at AFRL headquarters at WritePad on that. The other one is, imagine the Army guys, the 94th AAMDC, I forget the acronym, but they are essentially the guys who operate THAADs and Patriots, the defend assets. They said they're overwhelmed with information. They need help. And so the ground variant of Whopper is there to see, okay, if you have THAAD-like missiles, Patriot-like missiles, and other missiles, and futuristic stuff like railguns or lasers or electromagnetic weapons, how do you best use them, and how do you reduce the load on operators? And then we have the fighter one, which the fighter pilots would have on their screen, and it would suggest to them, okay, this is what your aircraft has. This is the best way to employ your kinetic systems, your missiles, and or futuristic laser capability. And so eventually this technology will crawl to other domains, to cyber and beyond. And right now, the Whoppers are individual actors, and the next phase is to begin linking them together via radio, via what we call Link 16, which is an old system for things in the air talking to each other, to the ground and back and forth, so that we can begin teaming, work the mathematics out of how to best optimize teams of Whoppers in different domains, in the air, on the ground, and elsewhere.
Okay, and that's one of the things you mentioned that's very interesting, is talking about how this wargaming can help, guide systems and people and how to operate in future, whatever it may be, like future fields. But an incredible thing about this, though, is you touched a point on where a lot of people are afraid with artificial intelligence or even machine teaming. They're like, oh, it's going to take over. There's no more human operators. But it sounds like using systems like this, it's just a tool. It's guiding, like, you should use this. I'd recommend this weapon in this situation. This will give you the best result. Like, that could be a machine teammate that you're saying. Like, that's one of the uses.
Yes. For the moment, I think it's human machine teaming. We'll wait for Hollywood to kick in later. But one of the great champions of chess was defeated in 1997, I believe, by Deep Blue, IBM's chess machine. And rather than leaving the field defeated, has created, and he's very active in, okay, world champions, bring your own supercomputer and we'll play against each other with our supercomputer backups. And so they've elevated the chess scoring from the 2000s, say, and I don't fully understand chess, to now the chess has reached the 4000s, way beyond what any humans would ever have been able to do without bringing their own supercomputers. Recently, a group of non-chess masters beat all the chess masters with their machine, chess. And it was uncanny, because it was embarrassing for the champions. But yes, you can leverage machine teaming with humans to get much better results.
Yeah, that sounds like one of the biggest results here of that. It's not only educational, but like you said, you can build on it and learn from it yourself. And that's
Yes.
a really big point we've touched on with your wargaming work here with Einstein and Chat GPT. I kind of want to bring this to a head then, especially with what we're doing at AFRL. In this kind of predictive nature of Einstein and everything we mentioned, what would you tell folks that are curious about the limitations of predictive software then? Could things like this have given us tools to prepare for some events that we could have predicted happening, like different either catastrophes around the world or even things happening with the climate? Is that possible, or is that so science fiction it's way off?
I think it's possible in limited cases, and then I'll go from the limited cases to where I think you hit a brick wall. I think we have enough digital data floating around the clouds out there in the internet world that you can begin to look for tense situations, highly correlated situations where there's a lot of emotion. Say there was an event called the Arab Spring, sparked by a single person who was trying to sell, stuff on the market to feed his kids, and the police took away whatever he was selling, and he was angry enough that he burned himself. I do believe he passed away, and then that sparked huge social change in the Middle East. I mean, it went from Tunisia to Egypt and beyond. And I think we might have, through social media, the ability to detect these things, and if we're nefarious, the ability to spark, a social catastrophe, or even to create these tensions, with artificial intelligence and machine learning, where nefarious actors can set things up to hurt democracy, say. And I do believe that it's not necessarily prediction, but you can drive something towards a higher probability. As far as general prediction, if we're in the movie The Matrix and I have that kind of computing power, I still don't think you're going to get very far, because our systems are chaotic. They're inherently nonlinear. If you have feedback, and it's the logistic equation, and it's the common example is the bunny rabbit problem of bifurcating populations. Very quickly the Fibonacci sequence in the feedback problem becomes chaotic. It just becomes totally unpredictable with just the slightest tweak in the reproduction rate. And that's what I think we're going to be extremely limited now. To counter that, there's a lot of things that are persistent in our worlds. My grocery store, my friends, there's been decades worth of persistence in that. So we'll see how far these things can go, but I don't think you can predict Arab Springs as much as you can drive things like that.
Well, it sounds like chaos theory still reigns, but I mean, that can make things difficult, of course. So, I mean, and it sounds like too, what you mentioned early on, like there's a lot of ethics that goes into this as well. Thinking about bad actors getting hold of things like this versus people in our hands trying to make the world a better place. There's a lot to discuss. You said it's nascent, though. It's still very early, so these debates about this are still happening.
Yes.
But it's interesting to hear that too, with how chaotic systems can be. It can be hard to predict, but again, tying it all together, it sounds like no matter what, this is still a fantastic tool that is going to hopefully help us along the way.
It could play into what Eisenhower said, right? The act of planning is very valuable.
Absolutely. And I think so we've had a lot of really interesting talks here about wargaming, predictability, about chat GPTs. Like it's really, we've run the gamut. So I kind of want to ask a final question for you then.
Sure.
So I know a lot of folks may be interested about working with things like chat GPT or making their own Einstein. What advice do you have for folks who are trying to break into this? Like saying, hey, I want to do what he did, building 101 different facets of Einstein, but let's say with Charlie Chaplin. Where would they start, or what should they do first?
Well, first of all, I've made my stuff available out there on through the Google Drive. It's just, you can go pull down the files. Second of all, it's just the world is so different in terms of education. There's so much stuff on YouTube. There's so much stuff on GitHub. I started by watching YouTube lectures from the TensorFlow, Google TensorFlow guys, and downloading their software and playing on my internet and just repeating what they did until I felt confident. I just use YouTube and use GitHub to pull down software and tinker and play. And we're in that age of Thomas Edison again, where you can tinker and play, and everything is so available. So just go and do.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and really diving into a really interesting subject people had questions about. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure as well. Thank you.
Make sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube at AF Research Lab. And remember, stay curious.
Logging off.